There is a kind of evil that hides in plain sight. And then there is a kind of evil that hides half a mile underground, behind a steel door, in the dark. In April of 1945, American soldiers blasted a hole through a brick wall deep inside a German salt mine and found 250 tons of gold, roughly 8,000 bars of it, stacked in neat rows, knee-high, reaching all the way to the back wall of a chamber the size of a city block. It was the entire reserve of Nazi Germany's central bank, hundreds of millions of dollars, the largest hoard of stolen wealth ever discovered in the history of warfare. The officers who found it thought they had uncovered the greatest treasure of the war. They were wrong, because mixed in among the gold bars in small, unmarked canvas bags, tucked off to the side, almost as an afterthought, was something else. Something that did not gleam. Something that, when one American officer untied the drawstring and looked inside, made him set the bag down very slowly and step backward. They hadn't factored in what a 60-year-old American general would do when he climbed down into that mine, opened one of those small bags with his own hands, and understood exactly what he was holding. This is the story of what George S. Patton found at the bottom of the Merkers salt mine, and the order he gave when he realized the gold of the Third Reich had been pulled from the mouths of the dead. To understand how the Americans found it, you have to go back 4 days to a quiet, half-destroyed town in central Germany called Merkers. The 4th of April, 1945. The war in Europe had about a month left, though no one walking that road knew it yet. 2 military policemen from Patton's Third Army, specifically the 90th Infantry Division, were on foot patrol through the town. Routine work, checking papers, watching for stragglers. The kind of cold, boring duty that filled the final weeks of a collapsing war. And then they saw 2 women walking down the street. The women were not German. They were French displaced persons, the army called them. Forced laborers. They had been ripped out of their homes in France and shipped to Germany to work, like millions of others, as slaves for the Reich. One of them was visibly pregnant. The MPs, following regulations about curfew, stopped them and started asking questions. The conversation that followed changed the entire ending of the war's treasure hunt. The women, grateful to be talking to Americans instead of Germans, began to talk. And almost in passing the way you might mention something everyone in town already knew, one of them pointed back toward the edge of the village, toward a salt mine, the Kaiserroda mine, and she told the MPs that the Germans had been bringing in truckloads of something heavy for weeks, crate after crate, lowered deep into the earth. Gold, she said. The Germans were hiding gold down there. The MPs did not laugh. They did not wave it off. They wrote it down and they sent it up the chain of command immediately. Now, think about that for a moment. The greatest financial discovery of the entire war did not come from a spy. It did not come from a code break or a captured map. It came from a forced laborer, a woman the Nazis had treated as property, who simply pointed and told the truth. There is a justice in that detail that no screenwriter could improve on. Within 48 hours, American intelligence officers were interrogating mine workers. The story held up. On April 6th, troops secured the entrance. By April 8th, engineers were preparing to blast their way into a sealed vault no one had the key to. And what waited for them behind that wall would stun 3 of the most powerful generals in the Allied armies into total silence. Put yourself down in that mine shaft. The air thick with salt. The only light from your own flashlight. And ahead of you a steel door. What do you think is on the other side? The 8th of April, 1945. The Americans had a problem. The vault deep inside the Kaiserroda mine was sealed behind a heavy door, and the key was missing. The mine officials claimed they didn't have it. Maybe they were lying. Maybe they weren't. It didn't matter. Fearing the entrance might be booby-trapped, American engineers packed explosives against the brick masonry beside the steel door and blew a hole straight through the wall. When the dust settled, the soldiers climbed through with their flashlights raised, and the beams landed on something that didn't look real. It was a chamber roughly 75 feet deep and 150 feet wide, carved out of solid salt, and inside it, in row after row after row, stacked with the obsessive neatness that only the German bureaucracy could produce, were the gold reserves of the Third Reich. 7,000 bags, 8,000 bars of gold bullion, bags of gold coins, boxes of platinum, sacks of foreign currency from a dozen conquered nations. The official inventory, filed later, ran to pages. more than 8,000 gold bars, hundreds of bags of coins. The total weight came to roughly 250 tons. In 1945 dollars, the hoard was valued at over 500 million. Today, the gold alone would be worth billions. Word reached 3rd Army headquarters fast, and on April 12th, 3 men came down into the mine together, descending in a rickety mine elevator, half a mile into the earth, packed shoulder to shoulder in the dark. General Dwight Eisenhower, General Omar Bradley, and General George S. Patton. There is a famous, grimly funny exchange that survives from that descent. As the elevator dropped on a single cable into the blackness, Patton looked at the thin wire holding them all and made a dark joke that if the cable snapped, promotions in the United States Army would come very quickly for a lot of people. Eisenhower, riding in that same cage, did not find it funny and told him to shut up. Even at the bottom of a mine, standing on top of the greatest treasure of the war, Patton was still Patton. But the gold was only half of what was down there, because off to one side, separate from the neat banking rows, sat a different kind of cargo. Smaller, uncatalogued, marked only with 2 letters that, to anyone who knew the war, meant something far darker than the Reichsbank. The Reichsbank gold had a kind of cold logic to it. It was stolen. Yes, looted from the treasuries of conquered nations, from Belgium, from the Netherlands, from Poland, but it was bankers' gold. Official, catalogued, evil in the way that paperwork can be evil. The bags marked S. S were something else entirely. These had been deposited separately by the SS Office for Economy and Administration, the same bureaucratic department that ran the concentration camps. The valuables inside had not come from any national treasury. They had come from people. When American officers began opening those bags and crates, they found gold wedding rings, thousands of them. Eyeglasses with gold frames, watches, cigarette cases, and in some of the bags, small canvas sacks. Unremarkable from the outside, they found gold fillings and gold teeth, pulled from the mouths of the dead, extracted from corpses at the camps before the bodies were burned in the ovens, melted down, or waiting to be melted, and converted into bars that would have entered the German economy as ordinary currency. I want to be careful here, because the truth does not need exaggeration. The official U.S. Army inventory of the Merkers mine lists, in plain bureaucratic language, hundreds of containers of what it simply called SS loot. Behind that flat phrase were the personal belongings and the bodies of people murdered in the camps. An American officer present during the inventory later described the moment of understanding. According to an account recorded from that day, he said the discovery left the men physically ill. That was the gold the Third Reich had been hiding. Not just stolen wealth, stolen lives, rendered down, bagged, filed, stacked in the dark, half a mile underground, waiting to be spent. If you've made it this far, you understand. This was never just a treasure story. This was evidence, the physical, undeniable proof of an industrial machine built to murder human beings and then strip the value from their corpses. And the man standing in that mine, the man who had spent 3 years fighting his way across Europe, was about to be shown exactly where this gold had come from. Stay with me, because the very next day, Patton walked into the place that made it. The same day the generals went down into the gold mine, the 12th of April 1945, they made a second stop. A few miles away, near the town of Gotha, sat a place called Ohrdruf. It was a subcamp of the larger Buchenwald complex, and it was the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by American forces that any of these 3 generals had seen with their own eyes. What they walked into is documented in army reports, in photographs, in the personal diaries of the men who were there. I will not dwell on the worst of it, but you have to understand what changed in those men that afternoon, because it explains everything Patton did next. The camp was not empty. Bodies lay in the yard where they had fallen. Some had been shot during the camp's hurried evacuation, days before the Americans arrived. There were piles of the dead, partially burned, the SS having run out of time to dispose of the evidence. The survivors who remained were skeletal, barely alive. Eisenhower walked through all of it deliberately. He forced himself to look at everything. He later explained why, in words that have outlived him. According to his own account, Eisenhower said he wanted to be able to testify firsthand if anyone ever dared claim these things were just propaganda. And Patton, the hardest man in the United States Army, the general who had slapped soldiers and cursed at chaplains and bragged, he was never afraid Patton could not do it. At one point during the tour, he stepped behind a building, and he was physically sick. He vomited. The man who had commanded armies across 2 continents could not keep his composure in the face of what the SS had built. That night, Patton wrote in his diary. The entry survives. He described the camp as, in his words, one of the most appalling sights that I have ever seen. Now connect the 2 halves of this single day. In the morning, Patton stood on top of 250 tons of gold, including bags of teeth and rings pulled from murdered prisoners. That same afternoon, he stood inside the kind of place where those teeth and rings had been taken. He saw the beginning and the end of the same machine, in the span of a few hours. He understood with total clarity what the gold actually was. And George Patton was not a man who understood something like that and then did nothing. Patton's response unfolded on 2 fronts, and both of them mattered. The first was the gold itself. There had been talk, serious talk, at the highest levels about what to do with 250 tons of recovered treasure. Some argued it should simply be absorbed, used to fund the occupation, divided among the victors as spoils of war. It was the oldest logic in human history. To the winner go the riches. Patton would have understood that logic. But the SS bags changed the equation completely. This was not anonymous treasure anymore. It was the property of murdered people. And the decision that came down, driven by what the generals had seen with their own eyes that day, was that the Merkers' hoard would be secured, inventoried down to the last ring, and treated as evidence. Between April 14th and 17th, the entire contents were loaded under heavy guard and convoyed to Frankfurt, catalogued in obsessive detail. Every bag, every bar, every container of what the Army flatly labeled SS loot. That meticulous record would later help return stolen property to the families of victims and to the nations the Nazis had robbed. The gold of the dead would not become the spoils of the living. Patton made sure of that. The second front was the German people themselves. In the days that followed Ohrdruf, Patton did something that became a pattern across the Third Army's sector. He refused to let the local civilians pretend they hadn't known. He ordered the citizens of nearby Gotha and the surrounding towns marched through the camps, made to walk past the bodies, made to look, made to see exactly what had been happening in the pretty villages they claimed were innocent. The mayor of one nearby town and his wife, forced to confront it, went home and hanged themselves that same night. The official reports tried to bury what happened next, the full scale of the reprisals, the quiet orders, the things that did not make it into the polished histories. But the photographs survived, the diaries survived, the inventory survived, and the gold, every catalogued ounce of it, survived as a permanent record of a crime that the perpetrators had tried to melt down into something untraceable. Patton turned their own treasure into the case against them. So what happened to it all? The Merkers' gold was moved to a secure vault in Frankfurt, and in the years that followed, the Allied powers established a formal process to return what could be returned. The looted national reserves were restituted to the countries they had been stolen from. Belgium, the Netherlands, and others slowly recovered what the Reichsbank had taken. The stolen artwork, hundreds of paintings from European museums, was gradually tracked down and sent home, much of it through the work of the men history would later call the Monuments Men. But the SS bags, the rings, the watches, the gold pulled from the mouths of the dead, those could never truly be returned. The people they belonged to were gone. There were no names attached, no way to reunite a single wedding ring with the finger it had been taken from. The best that could be done was to fold that value into reparations for the survivors and the heirs of the murdered. It was justice of a kind. Incomplete, the only kind available when the victims number in the millions. Patton himself had 8 months to live. He would die that December in a car accident near Mannheim, in the country he had helped conquer. He never wrote a memoir about the camps. He never had to. The diary entry was enough. One of the most appalling sights that I have ever seen. Here is what I keep coming back to. The Nazis built an entire machine to erase people, to turn human beings into smoke, and then into anonymous gold bars that could be spent in any market in the world. The whole point was that no one would ever be able to trace it back. No names, no record, no proof. And it failed. Because a French woman who had been enslaved pointed at a salt mine. Because 2 military policemen wrote it down instead of shrugging it off. Because 3 American generals went down into the dark and refused to look away. Because a meticulous inventory recorded every single bag. The evidence the SS tried to melt down became the very thing that documented their crime forever. Think about that. Now I want to turn this over to you because so many of you watching had family who were part of this. If your father, your grandfather, your great-uncle served in the European theater, if they marched with the Third Army, if they helped liberate a camp, if they were there in Germany in the spring of 1945, leave their name in the comments below. Tell us their unit. Tell us what they saw, what they told you, what they could never talk about. These men deserve to be remembered by more than a line in a record book. And the comment section under this video will outlast every history book ever written about this war. Their names belong here. Add them.